What happens when a former royal walks into a storm instead of a spotlight? What was meant to be a routine late-night appearance turned into one of the most explosive confrontations in recent television memory. Tonight we unpack the jaw-dropping sequence of events that unfolded when Meghan Markle joined The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, an interview intended to promote a new charitable initiative that instead descended into a high-stakes, on-air standoff. But before we peel back the curtain on what really happened, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Because once you hear this, you'll be questioning everything you thought you knew about live TV, media control, and Meghan Markle's public image. From the moment Meghan stepped onto the stage at the Ed Sullivan Theatre, the tension was unmistakable. Those familiar with Colbert's usual tone, a careful balance of wit and warmth, noticed immediately that something was off. The casual, friendly banter that typically sets the tone for the show was nowhere to be found. One crew member described the mood backstage as icy, with both teams treating the taping more like a diplomatic negotiation than a talk show segment. Meghan had arrived earlier that afternoon for the standard walkthrough and technical rehearsal. But even during those early hours, insiders say the mood was strained. Pre-approved talking points, arranged meticulously weeks in advance, were suddenly being renegotiated. Topics meant to highlight Meghan's philanthropy were overshadowed by last-minute legal demands. Certain questions were to be barred entirely, others rewritten, and some reportedly required Meghan's team to have editorial control over how footage might be cut. A highly unusual request for a show that prides itself on its live-to-tape spontaneity. Multiple sources confirmed that the atmosphere shifted dramatically in the final hours before taping. Several behind-the-scenes meetings between Colbert's producers and Meghan's publicists ran long, and tensions escalated over what could and couldn't be asked. Stephen Colbert, known for his razor-sharp satire and unflinching interviews, reportedly bristled at the restrictions being imposed on what was supposed to be an open conversation. He looked like someone walking into a trap, said one staffer who witnessed the final prep session. As the studio audience filed in that evening, they expected the usual mix of jokes, music, and a charming celebrity sit-down. What they got was something else entirely. Even the warm-up comedian, typically the source of energy and laughter, couldn't shake the odd atmosphere. Several audience members later said they felt a strange undercurrent in the room. Not fear exactly, but the sense that something unscripted and dangerous was about to happen. When Colbert launched into his opening monologue, it was clear to seasoned viewers that his delivery, while polished, was sharper than usual. His transitions between jokes were abrupt. His tone edged closer to biting than playful. Something was brewing, and it wasn't comedy. Behind the curtain, the stress mounted. Meghan's team had requested last-minute changes to lighting, chair, placement, and even camera angles. Demands that the technical crew found unnecessarily complicated and disruptive. The director, stage manager, and audio engineers were scrambling to adapt, their headsets filled with rapid-fire adjustments. And then, silence. Just before Colbert introduced his guest, a stillness fell over the room. It wasn't anticipation. It was tension. As he read the intro, his smile looked forced, his tone overly deliberate. The words were careful, calculated, controlled. Everyone watching, in the studio and eventually across millions of screens, could tell. This was no ordinary celebrity segment. When Meghan finally walked out, the crowd erupted. But it was a polite eruption, not an enthusiastic one. She looked composed, regal even as she crossed the stage and took her seat across from Colbert. But even her famously graceful demeanor couldn't mask the unease between them. What followed in the next hour was not just an interview. It was a confrontation, a subtle power struggle playing out under the bright lights of late-night television, where questions danced just close enough to controversy to draw gasps, and answers were met with tight smiles or clipped responses. The audience, and the world, watched as two professionals locked horns in a public performance of media control, image management, and unresolved tension. And that's just the beginning. If you want the full breakdown, every pointed question, every moment of awkward silence, every time the audience didn't quite know whether to clap, hit that bell icon. Because when a former royal walks into a room expecting praise and finds pushback instead, history isn't just made, it's televised. But even in those first few moments, it was clear this was no ordinary interview. The pleasantries were polite but distant, lacking the warmth and ease typical of the Late Show. Both Meghan and Colbert seemed locked in a kind of elegant standoff, each smiling through a layer of tension that never quite broke. Stephen's opening questions stayed safely within the agreed-upon boundaries, touching on Meghan's recent philanthropic work. She answered smoothly, her media training evident in every word. Her tone was polished, her delivery flawless, and the audience responded with polite applause. For a brief moment, it seemed like the interview might proceed without incident. Then, without warning, Stephen veered off script. The shift was subtle, so seamless most viewers likely missed it. But to anyone who understands the mechanics of a live interview, it was a deliberate pivot. Stephen leaned back slightly in his chair, his smile no longer fully reaching his eyes. "You know, Meghan, there's something I've always wondered," he said casually, though there was a faint sharpness in his tone. "You've spoken often about your dedication to authenticity and truth-telling, but there's been some inconsistency between certain public statements and documented facts. How do you reconcile that?" The question hit like a spark in dry brush. Meghan's smile faltered for just a heartbeat. She recovered quickly, but the moment was long enough to betray the first crack in her composure. Her voice, still pleasant, now carried a subtle, unmistakable steel. "That's a rather loaded question, Stephen," she said, her tone tightening. "I've always been committed to speaking my truth. Anyone suggesting otherwise might want to examine their own motives for challenging that commitment." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the charming celebrity banter they'd come for. Stephen, however, seemed only more focused, his instincts as a seasoned commentator now fully engaged. "But that's exactly what I'm getting at," he replied, leaning forward. "The phrase 'my truth' is interesting. It implies there could be multiple versions of the same reality. When certain claims you've made were later contradicted by evidence, documents, dates, other people's accounts, how do you explain those discrepancies?" Meghan visibly stiffened. The transformation was striking. The poised, camera-ready, public figure was giving way to someone unused to being cornered on live television. "I find it deeply concerning that you'd confront me with this kind of aggressive questioning," she said, her voice rising. "This feels more like an ambush than an interview. I was told we'd be discussing my charitable work and future projects, not rehashing narratives that have already been addressed, again and again." The studio fell into a thick, uneasy silence. Even the camera crew seemed frozen, caught in a moment that was rapidly slipping out of everyone's control. Stephen, to his credit, remained composed, but there was a glint of resolve in his eyes. He wasn't backing down. "I understand you may feel blindsided," he said evenly, "but I believe the audience deserves transparency. You've built a public platform based on your personal story. When elements of that story are called into question, it becomes fair game. That's not hostility. That's journalism." Meghan let out a sharp breath, incredulous. "Journalism? Is that what this is? Her tone was now unmistakably biting. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it feels more like a hit piece. I accepted this invitation in good faith. And this is how I'm repaid? With public interrogation?" The tension in the room was now unbearable. Audience members glanced at each other, unsure whether to applaud, gasp, or simply look away. The control room was in chaos, producers staring at monitors trying to decide whether to intervene or let the cameras roll. Stephen didn't flinch. "There's a line between courtesy and accountability," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "When public figures make statements that shape public discourse, those statements should be examined. That's not personal. It's responsibility." Meghan's composure finally cracked. Her voice now carried the unmistakable edge of anger. "Responsibility," she echoed, almost laughing. "Let's not pretend this is about journalistic ethics. This is theater, and I'm the headline act. You're hiding behind the word journalism to justify what amounts to a character assassination," Meghan said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I came here in good faith to talk about the work I'm doing to make a real difference. And instead, you're dragging me through some kind of public trial." The escalation was so sudden, even veteran crew members in the studio struggled to keep pace. What had begun as a routine celebrity interview was rapidly unraveling into something far more volatile, something unprecedented in the history of late-night television. Sensing the tension had reached a dangerous pitch, Stephen tried to moderate the tone without abandoning his line of questioning. "Look, I'm not trying to put you on trial," he said, voice tempered but steady. "But I do think it's fair to ask questions when there are discrepancies between public statements and public records. That's not personal. It's about holding public figures to the same standard as anyone else who chooses the spotlight." But Meghan was beyond diplomacy now. Her usual poise, honed over years of interviews, speeches, and carefully orchestrated appearances, seemed to vanish under the pressure. "The same standard?" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch and intensity. "I doubt you'd subject other guests to this kind of interrogation. This feels targeted, and frankly, it feels discriminatory. I can't help but wonder what's really motivating your approach tonight." Her words dropped into the room like a live wire. Stephen's expression hardened. For the first time, the polished host's mask slipped. Just slightly. "I'm going to stop you right there," he said, his voice suddenly steely. "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've interviewed people from every background imaginable. My questions are based on documented facts and legitimate concerns raised by multiple credible sources. If you'd like to address those, I'm all ears, but I won't sit here and be accused of bias simply for doing my job." The standoff had crystallized. Neither side was willing to yield. What was supposed to be a conversation about charitable work had morphed into a public clash, watched by a live audience that now sat frozen, caught between fascination and second-hand embarrassment. Meghan sat stiffly, hands clenched tightly, in her lap, while Stephen remained unmoved behind his desk, determined to finish what he'd started. Then she spoke. "You know what, Stephen?" Her voice took on a new timbre. Resolute, indignant, final. "I think I've heard enough. This whole thing, this setup, was clearly designed to embarrass me. I won't sit here and be subjected to this kind of treatment any longer." She shifted, forward in her seat, clearly preparing to leave. But Stephen wasn't ready to let it end. His experience had taught him that some of the most important truths emerge when the tension peaks. "I understand you're uncomfortable," he said, voice calm but unrelenting. But walking away doesn't answer the questions. If there are explanations for the inconsistencies we've raised, now would be the time to offer them. Otherwise, dismissing the entire conversation feels like avoiding accountability, not defending your truth. Meghan shot back immediately. Inconsistencies? You mean the lies? Spread by people with their own agendas? Her voice was rising, sharp as glass. I'm not going to dignify this circus with further participation. This right here is exactly the kind of toxic behavior that drove me away from public life in the first place. The irony of her statement, uttered on a late-night stage meant to amplify her public platform, was not lost on the room. Stephen seized on it. But you chose to re-enter public life, he said, voice cool, words deliberate. You've written books, given interviews, started podcasts, accepted speaking engagements. You can't seek public attention and then demand immunity from public scrutiny. That's not how it works, for anyone. That, it seemed, was the final straw. Meghan's composure shattered. How dare you? She spat, her voice trembling with fury. Audience members visibly flinched. You have no idea what I've endured, what my family has gone through, the price we've paid just to live our lives with dignity. This isn't journalism. It's cruelty. It's personal. Stephen, still seated, gave a firm but measured reply. Nothing I've said has been personal, he said. I've asked questions rooted in public record. If those questions feel like attacks, perhaps the issue isn't the questions, but the answers. By now it was clear. This was beyond repair. The interview had devolved into open combat. Neither participant was willing to retreat. Without another word, Meghan rose from her chair, abruptly, forcefully, startling the camera crew who scrambled to adjust their shots. I'm done with this, she said, her voice echoing across the silent studio. This isn't what I agreed to, and I will not be a part of this character assassination dressed up as journalism. And with that, she walked off the stage, leaving a stunned studio and millions of viewers grappling with what they had just witnessed. The studio fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. In all their years of live television, few among the crew had ever witnessed a guest walk out mid-interview, especially not like this. The logistics alone were chaotic. The audience was visibly unsettled, murmuring in confusion. Producers scrambled behind the scenes, facing a full-blown crisis with no playbook. To his credit, Stephen tried to steady the moment. Meghan, I understand you're upset, he said, voice calm but strained. But maybe we could both take a breath and continue this conversation constructively. But Meghan wasn't interested in de-escalation. There is no constructive way forward, she cut in, her voice echoing sharply across the studio as she rose from her chair and headed toward the edge of the set. This was a setup from the beginning. I knew something felt off during rehearsal, and I should have trusted my gut. Her sudden movement triggered a flurry of activity. The stage manager barked into his headset, coordinating frantic directives with the control room. Camera operators received conflicting instructions. Half told to track Meghan, the others told to hold on Stephen. Still seated at his desk, Stephen made one last effort to salvage the unraveling broadcast. If there's a concern about the questions, or the format, he offered, speaking directly to her, we can address that. But walking off doesn't resolve anything, and it certainly doesn't engage with the issues being raised. Meghan paused at the edge of the set. She turned back to face him, her expression a mix of fury and wounded pride. The only issue Here is your apparent belief that you have the right to publicly humiliate me," she said, her voice now shaking with restrained emotion. "I came here as a courtesy, and this is how that courtesy was treated?" Then came the moment that would echo across headlines and hashtags. Instead of simply leaving, Meghan pivoted to the audience, her voice projecting with the ease of someone used to commanding a room. "I want everyone here to know," she said, sweeping a hand toward the crowd. "This is not what was promised. You came expecting a thoughtful conversation, and instead, you've been made into spectators to a public." "Ambush!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few scattered claps rang out, some in support, others reflexive. Most sat frozen, uncertain how to react. Back at his desk, Stephen realized the interview had spiraled far past recovery. Rising slowly, he addressed both Meghan and the audience with measured authority. "I respect your right to leave if you feel uncomfortable," he began, his voice clear and composed. "But I also have a responsibility to my audience and to the principles of honest journalism. The questions I asked were based on facts already in the public domain. If that makes you uncomfortable, I understand, but I won't apologize for doing my job." That line landed like a gavel strike. The confrontation had crystallized. The moment of clarity. The point of no return. Meghan turned back for one last statement, her tone colder, sharper than ever. "Your job," she repeated, eyes narrowed. "If this is what you call journalism, then journalism is dead. A beat. I came here in good faith, and I'm leaving with my integrity intact, which is more than I can say for this show." And with that, she walked off the set, leaving behind a charged silence, a shaken crew, and an audience unsure whether to applaud or exhale. Stephen stood alone at center stage, cameras still rolling. He glanced briefly at the control booth, then looked straight into the lens. No one quite knew what to do next. What unfolded that night would be dissected, debated, and replayed endlessly online. But inside the Ed Sullivan Theater, those who were there knew they had just witnessed something seismic, something raw, unscripted, and permanently etched into the history of live television. Subscribe for more in-depth breakdowns of moments like this, and drop a comment below. What do you think was the real turning point? Was it Stephen crossing a journalistic line? Or did Meghan overreact to hard questions?